The morning had dawned grey and reluctant, as though the heavens themselves hesitated to illuminate what was to unfold within the ancient stones of St. Mary's Church. A fine mist clung to the lancet windows, blurring the world beyond into watercolour indistinctness, and within the side chapel where Miss Eleanor Hartley waited, the air had grown thick with the peculiar silence that accompanies abandonment. She sat upon the worn wooden pew, her wedding gown a cascade of ivory silk and Belgian lace that had seemed so luminous in her chamber that morning, but now felt heavy as chainmail, each layer of tulle and satin pressing down upon her shoulders with increasing weight. 3 hours had passed since the appointed time, 3 hours marked by the methodical ticking of the church clock, each chime reverberating through the empty nave like a judgment. The flowers that had been arranged with such care the evening before had begun to wilt in their vessels, rose petals curling inward as if retreating from some unseen threat, and the ribbon binding her bouquet had grown damp from her trembling hands. Eleanor had watched the dust motes dancing in the thin shafts of light that penetrated the gloom, had counted the cracks in the stone floor, had traced with her eyes the worn inscriptions on nearby memorials to the long dead, and through it all, she had told herself that there must be some explanation, some reasonable delay that would soon be remedied by the sound of footsteps and voices and the rustling commotion of arriving guests. But the church remained sepulchrally still. Even old Mr. Wickham, the verger, had ceased his nervous hovering and retreated to some distant corner, unable to bear witness to her vigil any longer. She thought, with a clarity that felt like glass breaking inside her chest, that hope was a peculiar torture. It kept one suspended in the moment just before devastation, stretching seconds into eternities, transforming each distant sound into a potential rescue that never materialized. The grey light filtering through the stained glass cast no cheerful colours across her gown, only a pallid, sickly illumination that made her think of ghosts and empty promises. Her mother's words from the night before echoed in her memory. "Tomorrow, dearest, all our troubles shall be remedied." How desperately they had needed this marriage, how fervently she had convinced herself that Mr. Philip Grenville's attentions were founded on genuine regard rather than her modest dowry. The warnings whispered by friends' half-concealed looks of concern, carefully worded cautions about his reputation, she had dismissed them all, had chosen to believe in the fairy tale her circumstances demanded. Now, as the church clock struck the 11th hour and still no one came, Eleanor felt the first cold tendrils of understanding creeping through her chest, wrapping around her heart with inexorable certainty. Something was terribly, irrevocably wrong, and she sat alone in her wedding finery, a bride without a groom, waiting in a church that had become not a sanctuary but a monument to her humiliation. The realization came not as a sudden blow, but as a slow drowning, each minute pulling her deeper beneath the surface of a truth she had been holding at bay with increasingly desperate mental exertions. Eleanor had constructed elaborate explanations in her mind: a carriage accident that had delayed the wedding party, a misunderstanding about the hour, some crisis that had required Philip's immediate attention. But as the clock struck 11:30, even these fragile architectures of hope crumbled into dust. She remembered now, with a clarity that felt like punishment, the way Philip had kissed her hand at their parting 2 evenings prior, how his fingers had trembled slightly, how his eyes had not quite met hers when he promised that their wedding day would change everything. She had attributed his nervousness to bridegroom's anxiety, had found it endearing even, never imagining it was the guilty tremor of a man planning betrayal. The engagement itself had been a whirlwind affair, precipitated by her father's death 6 months earlier, and the subsequent discovery that his affairs were in far greater disarray than anyone had suspected. The estate was encumbered with debts, her mother's health was failing, and her younger sister's prospects hung precariously upon Eleanor's ability to make an advantageous match. When Mr. Philip Grenville, handsome, charming, possessed of an adequate fortune and connections to the Duke of Thornbridge himself, had shown interest in her at the Midsummer Assembly, it had seemed like divine intervention. Her friend Judith had pulled her aside at the betrothal celebration and asked, with concern evident in her gentle eyes, whether Eleanor was certain of Mr. Grenville's character, whether she had heard the whispers about his gambling and his associations with questionable company. But Eleanor had smiled and dismissed such talk as mere gossip, the jealous murmurings of those who resented her good fortune. How foolish that confidence seemed now, sitting alone in her wedding gown, while the minutes stretched into a fourth hour of waiting. The sound of footsteps finally broke the oppressive silence, and Eleanor's heart leapt with a pathetic surge of hope before she recognized them as belonging to Mr. Wickham, whose face, when he appeared in the chapel doorway, was arranged in an expression of such profound pity that she felt her spine stiffen instinctively against it. "Miss Hartley," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking softly might somehow cushion the blow of what he had come to say, "I am grievously sorry to inform you that there has been word from Mr. Grenville's lodgings. It seems," he faltered, his aged hands twisting together in manifest discomfort, and Eleanor found herself rising from the pew with a strange calmness, as though she were watching herself from a great distance. "He is not coming," she said, and it was not a question but a statement, flat and final as a tombstone inscription. The verger's nod of confirmation was almost redundant. She had known, somewhere in the deepest chambers of her heart, from the moment the first hour had passed without explanation, that she had been jilted, abandoned, left waiting in a church like some cautionary figure from a moral tale. And as this knowledge settled fully into her bones, Eleanor discovered that she possessed reserves of pride she had not known existed, for she did not weep or wail or collapse, but merely gathered her heavy skirts in her hands and asked, in a voice that barely trembled, if Mr. Wickham might be so kind as to summon her carriage, for there was clearly nothing more to wait for in this place that had promised joy but delivered only the most exquisite species of humiliation. Eleanor had scarcely begun to gather herself for departure when the great oaken doors of the church opened with a resonance that seemed to shake the very foundations, and into the dim sanctuary strode a figure whose presence transformed the atmosphere as utterly as lightning transforms a darkened sky. The Duke of Thornbridge, for it could be no other, given the unmistakable bearing of absolute authority and the severe elegance of his attire, advanced down the centre aisle with long, purposeful strides, his greatcoat billowing behind him like the wings of some avenging angel, and Eleanor, still standing in the side chapel with her wedding gown pooled around her like sea foam, felt herself freeze in an attitude of mortification so complete that she could not even summon the will to flee. He was tall, formidably so, with dark hair that showed threads of silver at the temples, despite his years numbering perhaps 35, and his face was all sharp angles and austere planes, handsome in the manner of a hawk or some other noble predator, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. His grey eyes swept the empty church with an expression of barely contained fury, and when they finally alighted upon Eleanor, standing there in her bridal magnificence amid the wilting flowers and abandoned hope, something flickered across his features, surprise perhaps, or recognition, or the faintest shadow of discomfort, before his countenance hardened once more into a mask of aristocratic disdain. "Miss Hartley, I presume," he said, and his voice was deep and cold as winter water, carrying the accent of one educated at Cambridge and raised in drawing-rooms where every word was measured for its strategic value, and Eleanor, summoning reserves of dignity from some deep well she had not known she possessed, lifted her chin and met his gaze with all the composure she could command, though she felt her humiliation settling upon her shoulders like a mantle of lead. "Your Grace," she replied, proud that her voice emerged steady despite the trembling that had overtaken her limbs, and she observed the way his eyes travelled over her wedding gown with something that might have been contempt or might merely have been the aristocratic assessment of one who sees clearly the pretensions of those beneath his station. He made no bow, offered no courtesy beyond a curt inclination of his head, and proceeded to speak with the blunt directness of one accustomed to issuing commands rather than making conversation. "I am searching for my cousin, Mr. Philip Grenville, who was, I understand, meant to meet you here this morning." The way he pronounced the word "meant" carried within it volumes of skepticism and disdain, as though the very notion of Philip fulfilling any obligation was laughable, and Eleanor felt something hot and bitter rise in her throat, whether rage or grief, she could not say. "Mr. Grenville is not here, as you can observe," she said, gesturing with one gloved hand at the conspicuously empty church, at the pews that should have been filled with well-wishers and witnesses, but instead held only shadows and the ghosts of her shattered expectations, and she watched as the Duke's jaw tightened, a muscle working beneath the skin in a manner that suggested he was grinding his teeth upon some unspoken fury. "So I see," he said, and now his gaze upon her held something else, something that looked almost like calculation, as though he was solving some complex equation in which she was merely one unfortunate variable. And Eleanor found herself straightening her spine even further, refusing to crumble beneath the weight of his regard, refusing to become simply another pitiable figure in whatever sordid drama Philip Grenville had authored, refusing, above all, to let this cold, imperious man see just how thoroughly her heart had been broken in this place, that should have witnessed her joy, but had instead become the theatre of her complete undoing. The Duke's expression shifted then, becoming something harder and more terrible than mere disdain. And when he spoke again, his words fell upon Eleanor like stones cast into still water, each one creating ripples of devastation that spread outward until her entire world was disturbed by their impact. "Miss Hartley, I have come here not in search of my cousin for sentimental reasons, but because I have spent the past 2 days attempting to untangle the wreckage of his affairs, and what I have discovered is considerably worse than a simple failure of nerve." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words with the care of one handling explosives, and Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat, some instinct warning her that whatever revelation was coming would shatter what few illusions remained to her. "Philip has fled to the continent, to France, my investigators believe, and he has not gone alone but in the company of a Mrs. Lucia Fairchild, a widow of questionable reputation, with whom he has apparently been entangled for the better part of a year." The church seemed to tilt around Eleanor, the stone walls and vaulted ceiling suddenly unstable, but she locked her knees and kept her expression carefully neutral, determined not to give this cold, imperious man the satisfaction of witnessing her complete collapse. "Furthermore," the Duke continued, his grey eyes fixed upon her with an intensity that felt almost surgical, as though he were cataloguing each minute reaction for future reference, "my investigation has revealed that your dowry, the £5,000 your family provided upon the engagement, was gambled away by Philip over the course of several weeks at various establishments of ill repute in London, the final portion lost in a single disastrous evening at a faro table in a club I shall not name in present company." Eleanor heard the words, understood their meaning, but found herself unable to fully comprehend their implications. That money had represented everything her family had left, scraped together through the sale of her mother's jewels and her father's remaining investments, offered up as the price of her security and theirs, and now it was simply gone, dissolved into the ether of Philip Grenville's weakness and vice. "I see," she said, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears, distant and hollow, as though it belonged to someone else entirely, and she watched the Duke's expression shift again, something that might have been respect or possibly merely surprise flickering across his austere features as he observed her refusal to succumb to hysterics. "Miss Hartley," he said, and now his tone had gentled fractionally, though it remained formal and proper, "I cannot undo the damage my cousin has inflicted upon you, but I can at the very least ensure that you do not face the immediate aftermath of this catastrophe alone. My carriage is waiting outside. Permit me to escort you to your home." The offer hung in the air between them, and Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse, to cling to whatever tattered shreds of dignity remained by rejecting his assistance, by walking out of this church alone, as she had waited alone. But even as she opened her mouth to decline, she recognized the futility of such pride. She had no carriage of her own waiting, having planned to depart in Philip's after the ceremony, and the prospect of walking through the village in her wedding gown, while curious eyes peered from windows, was suddenly more than she could contemplate. "That will not be necessary, Your Grace," she heard herself say nonetheless. "I am quite capable of making my own arrangements." But the Duke shook his head, and for the first time, something that might have been genuine feeling entered his voice as he replied, "Miss Hartley, my cousin has brought sufficient shame upon my family name today. Allow me to preserve what little honor remains to us by performing this one service. I insist." And there it was, buried beneath the aristocratic coldness and the formal propriety, a thread of something that might have been decency, or perhaps merely the rigid code of honor that governed men of his station. And Eleanor, recognizing that she had neither the strength nor the resources to refuse, finally nodded her acquiescence and allowed the Duke of Thornbridge to offer his arm and escort her, in all her bridal finery and fresh devastation, out of the church where she had been so thoroughly betrayed and into an uncertain future that seemed to stretch before her like an uncharted sea. The Duke's carriage proved to be as austere and magnificent as the man himself, all dark leather and polished wood, with the Thornbridge crest emblazoned upon the door in silver and midnight blue, and as Eleanor settled herself upon the seat, still encumbered by the ridiculous volume of her wedding gown, which seemed determined to mock her with every rustle of silk and lace, she felt the weight of the morning's catastrophe finally beginning to penetrate the numbness that had sustained her through the worst of her humiliation. The Duke sat opposite her, maintaining a distance that was both physically and emotionally vast. And as the carriage lurched into motion, beginning its journey through the autumn countryside toward her family's modest estate, Eleanor found herself trapped in a silence so oppressive it seemed to possess actual weight, pressing down upon her chest until she could scarcely draw breath. Through the window she watched the landscape roll past fields, gone golden with harvest, trees aflame with leaves of crimson and amber, the entire world dressed in the colors of ending and decay, and thought how fitting it was that her life should collapse in autumn, in this season of dying things and gathering darkness. The Duke sat motionless as carved stone, his grey eyes fixed upon some point beyond the window, and Eleanor wondered what thoughts moved behind that austere countenance, whether he felt contempt for her foolishness in accepting Philip's suit, or merely the cold satisfaction of one who has successfully discharged an unpleasant obligation. She could feel her composure beginning to fracture, hairline cracks appearing in the facade of dignity she had maintained so carefully, and she turned her face toward the window so he would not observe the trembling of her lips or the moisture gathering in her eyes, despite her best efforts to contain it. The first sob escaped her throat before she could suppress it, a small sound of anguish that seemed obscenely loud in the carriage's confined space, and she pressed her gloved hand to her mouth, mortified to be breaking down before this cold, imperious stranger who already had ample reason to think her pitiable. But then, with a gesture so unexpected it shocked her into momentary stillness, the Duke reached into his coat and withdrew a handkerchief of fine linen, offering it to her without a word, and when Eleanor finally accepted it, her fingers brushing his for the briefest instant, she thought she detected something in his expression that might have been sympathy, or perhaps merely the discomfort of one unaccustomed to witnessing feminine distress. "Philip and I were raised together after my parents died," he said abruptly, his voice cutting through her tears with the precision of a blade. "He was given every advantage, every opportunity to make something honorable of himself, and he has squandered all of it in pursuit of pleasure and immediate gratification, caring nothing for the destruction he leaves in his wake." Eleanor raised her eyes to his face and saw there a complexity of emotion. She had not expected anger, certainly, but also something that looked almost like grief, the particular sorrow of one who has lost faith in someone once valued. "I have spent years attempting to shield him from the consequences of his choices," the Duke continued, paying his debts, smoothing over his scandals, telling myself that eventually he would mature into responsibility, and instead he has this. His gesture encompassed Eleanor, the wedding gown, the entirety of the disaster, and she found herself nodding, understanding that Philip Grenville had destroyed more than her dreams today, had betrayed more than her trust. The carriage turned onto the narrow lane that led to her family's estate, and Eleanor watched the Duke's expression shift as he observed the modest house with its peeling paint and overgrown gardens, the visible markers of genteel poverty that her family had attempted to disguise but which were unmistakable to an educated eye, and she saw him comprehend fully, perhaps for the first time, just how desperate her circumstances had been, how completely Philip's betrayal had devastated not merely her heart, but her family's very survival. The weeks that followed Eleanor's abandoned wedding unfolded with the inexorable quality of a nightmare from which one cannot wake, each day bringing fresh humiliations and mounting catastrophes that seemed designed by some cruel providence to test the very limits of human endurance. Within 3 days of that terrible morning, the story had spread through society like plague, through a medieval city whispered in drawing rooms, discussed over tea, embellished with each retelling, until Eleanor found herself transformed from a respectable young woman into an object of either pity or scorn, depending on the temperament of those who spoke her name. Former friends who had once called upon her with regularity now crossed to the opposite side of the street when they encountered her in the village, their discomfort with scandal outweighing whatever genuine affection they might once have felt, and Eleanor learned the particular bitter lesson that adversity reveals the true character of one's acquaintances, stripping away the veneer of polite society to expose the self-preservation and cowardice beneath. Her family's financial situation, already precarious before Philip's betrayal, rapidly deteriorated into something approaching desperation as creditors who had been patient in anticipation of the dowry's return now demanded immediate payment, and Eleanor watched her mother's health decline with each new crisis, the older woman taking to her bed with an illness born as much of anxiety and shame as any physical ailment. The necessity of dismissing servants became unavoidable, first the under-housemaid, then the groom, finally even Mrs. Carson, who had been with the family since Eleanor was a child, and each departure felt like another small death, another acknowledgement of how far they had fallen and how much further they might yet descend. Eleanor herself began the grim work of cataloguing which possessions might be sold, moving through the house like an appraiser at an estate sale, attaching monetary value to objects that held primarily sentimental worth, and discovering in the process that sentiment commanded no price in the marketplace. It was during this period of progressive dismantling that the Duke of Thornbridge became an unexpected and somewhat inexplicable presence in her life, appearing at intervals that seemed carefully calculated to coincide with moments of particular crisis, his imposing figure and austere countenance becoming oddly familiar fixtures in her family's modest drawing room. He came first with a formal apology on behalf of his family, delivered with stiff propriety but evident sincerity, and then returned several days later with questions about Philip's debts, which families had been affected, which tradesmen left unpaid, the full scope of his cousin's financial destruction, and Eleanor observed that he took meticulous notes, his grey eyes growing harder with each new revelation of Philip's perfidy. She did not understand why he continued to involve himself in their affairs, could not fathom what motivated a man of his station to concern himself with the wreckage of a scandal that was not of his making, but she found herself watching for his visits with something that was neither quite hope nor quite dread, some complicated emotion that had no proper name. He observed everything during these visits: her mother's declining health, the gradual disappearance of familiar objects from the house, the worn patches on the drawing-room carpet that could no longer be concealed, Eleanor's own increasing exhaustion as she took on work previously done by servants, and though he said little, she sensed in him a quality of watchful assessment, as though he were gathering information toward some purpose he had not yet revealed. There was something in his manner during these encounters that had shifted since that first terrible day, a softening so subtle it might have been imagined, visible only in the way his expression gentled fractionally when he observed her struggling to maintain dignity while her world crumbled, and Eleanor found herself wondering what thoughts moved behind that austere facade, whether he saw in her resilience something worthy of respect, or merely the pathetic struggles of one drowning slowly in circumstances beyond her control. The Duke of Thornbridge's investigation into his cousin's activities had revealed a scope of destruction that exceeded even his darkest expectations, for Philip's gambling debts had not merely touched one or two families, but had created a network of financial devastation that extended through the county like roots of poison oak, each transaction connected to another until the full picture emerged of a man who had systematically betrayed everyone foolish enough to trust him. And as Alexander sat in his study reviewing the ledgers and letters his solicitor had compiled, he felt something shift within him, a cold fury giving way to something more complex and considerably more dangerous to his peace of mind. He had watched Eleanor Hartley navigate her family's collapse with a grace and dignity that would have done credit to a duchess born to the role, had observed her sacrifice her own comfort without complaint, tend her ailing mother with tireless devotion, and face society's cutting judgment with her head held high and her composure intact. And he had found himself thinking of her at odd moments during estate business, while riding across his lands, in the quiet hours before sleep, wondering what she was doing, whether her circumstances had worsened, if she was eating properly, or sacrificing meals to extend their dwindling resources. This preoccupation troubled him, for he was not a man given to sentiment or impulsive feeling, had built his life upon logic and duty and the careful management of emotion, yet he could not deny that something in her situation, or perhaps in her specifically, had breached his carefully constructed defenses and lodged itself somewhere in the region of his conscience, or perhaps his heart, though he was reluctant to examine that possibility too closely. The solution, when it came to him, arrived with the sudden clarity of mathematical proof, inevitable and irrefutable. He would marry her himself, not from love, for he scarcely knew what that word meant beyond poetry and songs, but from a calculated recognition that such a union would serve multiple purposes simultaneously, restoring his family's honor, providing Eleanor and her family with security, and perhaps quieting the strange restlessness that had plagued him since that morning in the church when he had first encountered her in her ruined wedding gown, all dignity and devastation. He arrived at her family's estate on a grey afternoon that threatened rain, was shown into the drawing room where even more furniture had disappeared since his last visit, and found Eleanor alone, her mother presumably still confined to her bedchamber, and he observed the shadows beneath her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands as she offered him tea they could ill afford, the proud set of her shoulders even as her world crumbled around her. "Miss Hartley," he began, dispensing with preliminary courtesies because he suspected she had neither time nor patience for social niceties, "I have a proposal to make which I believe will prove advantageous to both our circumstances." He watched wariness flicker across her face, the instinctive drawing back of one who has learned that proposals from gentlemen are not to be trusted, and he continued before she could refuse to hear him. "I am proposing marriage, a practical arrangement that would provide your family with immediate financial security and restore to you the position in society that my cousin's actions destroyed." The shock on her face was absolute, her teacup freezing halfway to her lips before she set it down with trembling hands. "Your Grace, I cannot. I will not accept an offer made from pity or obligation," she said, her voice steady despite the pallor of her cheeks, and he felt a surge of admiration for her pride, even as he recognized it as the primary obstacle to her salvation. "This is not pity," he replied, with a curtness born of his own discomfort with the emotions churning beneath his austere facade. "It is restitution for my family's actions, and a practical solution to circumstances that benefit neither of us in their current state." They negotiated then, not as suitor and beloved, but as two parties to a business arrangement, discussing settlements and expectations with a frankness that would have scandalized proper society. And when she finally, reluctantly, agreed her acceptance, delivered not with joy but with the grim resignation of one who recognizes necessity, Alexander told himself the strange tightness in his chest was merely satisfaction at a problem solved, and not at all the first stirrings of something far more dangerous and infinitely more complicated. The second wedding took place on a morning in late winter, when frost still clung to the church windows, and the pale sunlight filtering through the stained glass held no warmth, 3 months almost to the day after that first terrible ceremony that had never been, and Eleanor stood in the same vestibule wearing a different gown, simpler, more sombre, the ivory silk purchased by the Duke's solicitor and delivered to her home with business-like efficiency, and felt nothing but a peculiar numbness, as though some essential part of herself had been carefully excised and stored away where it could no longer be damaged. The contrast between the two wedding days struck her with almost mythic symbolism. Where once there had been the promise of guests and celebration, now there were only the necessary witnesses, the vicar who had pitied her abandonment, now officiating her rescue, with barely concealed relief that the scandal would be properly resolved, and where once she had harbored foolish dreams of affection, if not love, now she approached the altar with the grim pragmatism of one entering into a business contract, which was, she reminded herself, precisely what this arrangement was. Alexander stood waiting with his customary austere dignity, his expression revealing nothing of whatever thoughts moved behind those grey eyes, and when she took her place beside him, she noted the careful distance he maintained, as though even in this moment of legal union, he was establishing the boundaries that would govern their married life. The ceremony proceeded with swift efficiency, the ancient words that should have carried weight of romance and promise, instead falling like coins being counted, each phrase a transaction, each vow a clause in their agreement, and when the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Alexander's kiss upon her cheek was brief and formal, the touch of his lips as impersonal as a signature upon a document. Eleanor moved through the remainder of the day as though observing herself from a great distance, watching this woman, who was now a duchess, accept congratulations from the few witnesses, sign her new name in the parish register, with a hand that did not tremble because she would not permit it to tremble. Except her new husband's arm for the walk to the carriage that would carry them to Thornbridge Manor, the journey passed in near silence, the winter landscape rolling past the windows, while inside the carriage a chill prevailed that had nothing to do with the weather, and Eleanor found herself remembering that first carriage ride when she had wept and he had offered his handkerchief, wondered if he too was thinking of that day and how far they had travelled to arrive at this strange destination. Evening found them in the grand manor that was now her home, dining in formal state at opposite ends of a table that could have seated 20, and when the interminable meal finally concluded, Alexander escorted her to her chambers, notably separate from his own, with a politeness that somehow emphasized the transactional nature of their union more than any coldness could have done. "I hope you will find everything to your satisfaction," he said, his voice carefully neutral, and she replied with equal formality that she was certain she would, and then he bowed slightly and departed, and Eleanor stood alone in rooms more luxurious than any she had ever inhabited, and felt the full weight of understanding settle upon her. She had escaped financial ruin and social disgrace, had secured her family's future, and regained a position in society, but she had done so by entombing herself in a marriage that would never hold warmth or genuine affection, and as she prepared for bed in her solitary chamber, she made a silent vow to herself that she would never make the mistake of hoping for more than what had been explicitly negotiated, would never allow herself the dangerous luxury of imagining that duty might somehow transform into devotion, would protect what remained of her heart behind walls that no one, not even the complicated, austere man who was now her husband, would ever breach again. Thornbridge Manor rose from the landscape like something from a fever dream, all grey stone and towering chimneys and windows that caught the thin winter light and reflected it back with a coldness that seemed to penetrate Eleanor's very bones, as the carriage rounded the final curve of the drive and delivered her to what would now be her home, and she found herself thinking that the house suited her new husband, perfectly impressive, imposing, beautiful in its austere way, and utterly impenetrable to any warmth or genuine feeling. The staff assembled to greet their new Duchess numbered more than 30, and Eleanor moved down the line with the careful grace she had cultivated during those terrible weeks after her abandonment, learning each name and position while acutely aware of their assessing gazes, their curiosity about the woman their master had married so suddenly and under such peculiar circumstances, and she wondered what stories had reached them, what gossip had preceded her arrival, whether they knew she had been jilted at the altar before becoming a duchess. Mrs. Hendricks, the housekeeper, showed her through rooms of such magnificence that Eleanor found herself momentarily breathless, drawing rooms furnished with pieces that belonged in museums, a ballroom that could accommodate 200 guests, a music room housing a pianoforte more valuable than her family's entire former estate, and with each chamber they entered, Eleanor felt the weight of her new position settling more heavily upon her shoulders, the understanding that she was now mistress of an establishment whose annual expenditure likely exceeded what her family had possessed in total. Alexander maintained his careful distance, appearing at meals with punctual formality and departing again with equal promptness, their conversations limited to necessary courtesies and brief exchanges about household matters, and Eleanor quickly learned the rhythm of her new life. Breakfast taken in solitary dignity in her chambers, mornings spent with Mrs. Hendricks reviewing menus and household accounts, afternoons in the small sitting room that had been designated as her personal domain, evenings dining with a husband who sat 12 feet away and might as well have been in another country for all the connection that existed between them. Yet she observed him, for there was little else to occupy her attention in those early weeks, and she noticed things that surprised her: the way he spoke to servants with genuine courtesy rather than aristocratic condescension, how he knew the names of the stable boys and asked after their families, the patience he showed with his horses, especially an aging grey mare that had clearly outlived her usefulness, but was maintained in comfortable retirement because, as she overheard one groom say, His Grace couldn't bear to turn out an old friend who had served faithfully. These small glimpses into his character troubled her, for they suggested depths beneath the austere surface that made her situation more complicated, made it harder to maintain the emotional distance she had vowed to preserve, and she found herself lying awake in her luxurious bedchamber, all silk hangings and fine linens, and a loneliness more profound than any she had known in poverty, wondering if she had traded one form of misery for another, if a lifetime of comfort without connection might prove harder to bear than financial struggle had been, and understanding with a clarity that brought no consolation that she had become exactly what she had sworn never to be, a woman trapped in a marriage of convenience, surrounded by magnificence, and utterly, irrevocably alone. The fever came upon Eleanor with terrifying swiftness in the 4th week of her residence at Thornbridge Manor, beginning as a slight chill during breakfast that she dismissed as merely the draughty enormity of the dining room, progressing by afternoon to a weakness that made climbing the stairs to her chambers an ordeal, and by evening manifesting as a raging heat that left her insensible and thrashing among sweat-soaked linens, while Mrs. Hendricks sent urgent summons for both the physician and the Duke. Alexander arrived in her chambers to find her lost to delirium, speaking in fragments to people who were not present, pleading with Philip not to leave her, begging her father not to force the marriage, whispering brokenly about the church and the waiting and the terrible moment when she had understood that no one was coming, and something in hearing these unguarded revelations, this raw evidence of damage that her careful dignity had concealed, struck him with unexpected force, made him understand for the first time the true depth of what his cousin's cruelty had cost her. He dismissed the servants and took up position in the chair beside her bed, and there he remained through that night and the next day and the following night, leaving only when absolutely necessary, watching her fight the fever, while Dr. Pemberton applied cold compresses and administered draughts, and spoke in grave tones about the crisis that must come. During the worst of her delirium, she spoke of dreams she had harbored as a girl, of a marriage built on affection, of children raised with love rather than duty, of a partnership where she might be valued for more than her family connections, and Alexander found himself profoundly moved by these modest aspirations that Philip's abandonment and his own cold arrangement had together destroyed, found himself experiencing an unfamiliar twist of something that might have been guilt or regret, or perhaps the first stirrings of a feeling he was not yet prepared to name. The fever broke on the 3rd morning as pale sunlight filtered through the chamber windows, and Eleanor's eyes opened with genuine awareness. For the first time in days, confusion crossing her features as she registered her husband sitting beside her bed, his formal attire rumpled and his expression holding a weariness that suggested he had maintained his vigil for some time. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice hoarse and wondering, and he found himself reaching for her hand almost without conscious thought, his fingers closing around hers with a gentleness that surprised them both. "I could not leave you to fight alone," he said quietly, and then, with evident difficulty, added, "You spoke during the fever. I heard things I should have understood before. The damage Philip caused goes deeper than I knew, and my own coldness has likely deepened those wounds rather than allowing them to heal. For that, I find I must apologize." Eleanor stared at him with an expression caught between vulnerability and wariness, her hand still resting in his, and for a long moment something passed between them that had never existed in their careful, formal exchanges, a genuine connection, fragile as new ice, but real nonetheless. Then the moment fractured as propriety reasserted itself, and Alexander withdrew his hand while Eleanor turned her face away, both retreating to the safety of distance even as they privately acknowledged that something fundamental had shifted, that a crack had appeared in the walls they had each constructed, and neither was entirely certain whether to be terrified or grateful for what might eventually pass through. Eleanor's recovery from the fever progressed slowly through the following weeks, and as autumn deepened its hold upon the countryside, painting the estate grounds in shades of amber and crimson that seemed almost painfully beautiful, she found herself experiencing something unexpected, small moments of connection with her husband that accumulated like fallen leaves, unremarkable individually, but gradually creating a landscape transformed. It began with the library, that magnificent room she had discovered during her first tour of the manor, 3 stories of books rising toward a painted ceiling depicting classical scenes of learning and philosophy, and she had taken to spending her afternoons there during her convalescence, finding solace among volumes that asked nothing of her but attention. Alexander discovered her there one evening as October rain drummed against the tall windows, her feet tucked beneath her in one of the leather chairs, so absorbed in a volume of poetry that she startled visibly when he cleared his throat, and something in her unguarded expression, pleasure interrupted rather than duty performed, made him pause in the doorway with an unfamiliar hesitation. "I did not mean to disturb you," he said quietly, and she noticed he held a book himself, had clearly come here for his own purposes rather than seeking her out, and the realization somehow made his presence less threatening, transformed the moment from formal interaction into accidental convergence. They shared the space that evening in companionable silence, and the next evening he appeared again, and within a week a routine had established itself. Without either of them explicitly acknowledging it, tea brought at 8. The two of them settling into their respective chairs, reading or occasionally discussing some passage that had captured attention, the conversation flowing more naturally in this neutral space than it ever had across the formal expanse of the dining table. Alexander began, almost tentatively, to share details of estate business with her, asking her thoughts on matters he might easily have kept to himself, and Eleanor found herself responding with opinions she had not known she possessed, suggestions drawn from her own family's more modest management and her observations of tenant welfare, and she noticed his expression when she proposed a system for winter relief that would preserve dignity while providing necessary assistance. Surprise, giving way to consideration, giving way to respect that warmed her more than she wished to admit. His regard for her intelligence manifested in small gestures that might have seemed insignificant to an observer but felt monumental to Eleanor. After months of being treated as decorative necessity, he began seeking her input before making decisions about household matters, deferred to her judgment regarding the staff, implemented her suggestions, and credited her publicly when they proved successful, and she felt something long dormant stirring within her, some sense of value beyond her family connections or her suitability as a wife. Then came the evening when they were reviewing agricultural reports together, and she made an observation about crop rotation that made him laugh, genuine amusement rather than polite acknowledgement, and their eyes met across the small table they had drawn between their chairs, and Eleanor found herself smiling in return, the expression feeling strange on her face after so many months of careful neutrality. And for a moment something passed between them that was neither duty nor arrangement, but simply two people discovering unexpected pleasure in each other's company. Neither spoke of it afterward, both retreating into familiar formality as if by unspoken agreement, but Eleanor lay awake that night, thinking about the sound of his laughter and the way his severe features had transformed with genuine pleasure, and she understood with a clarity that brought both hope and terror that the walls she had built around her heart were beginning to develop fissures, that despite every vow she had made to protect herself, she was beginning to care for her husband in ways that went far beyond the terms of their careful arrangement. The announcement of the Thornbridge Winter Ball arrived with December's first snow, a social obligation that Alexander could not reasonably avoid given his position, and Eleanor received the news with a dread that manifested as physical weight in her chest, the prospect of facing society as the Duchess of Thornbridge, of standing before those who had witnessed or whispered about her humiliation, filled her with an anxiety she could not entirely conceal, despite her best efforts at composure. She stood for fittings with the modiste Alexander had summoned from London, submitting to the creation of a gown in deep sapphire silk that the woman insisted would be perfection itself, but Eleanor saw only another costume for another performance, another test she might fail before an audience eager to find her wanting. The evening of the ball arrived cold and crystalline, the manor ablaze with candlelight and filled with the cream of society, and Eleanor descended the main staircase feeling much as she had in that church months ago on display, vulnerable, waiting for judgment until she reached the bottom step and found Alexander waiting there, something in his expression as he took in her appearance making her breath catch, a warmth in his gaze that was neither dutiful nor detached, but genuinely appreciative, almost possessive. He offered his arm and leaned close enough to whisper, "You are magnificent, and I shall be the envy of every man present." And though she knew such words were likely mere courtesy, they steadied her nonetheless as they moved into the ballroom to receive their guests. She felt the stares, heard the whispers that were perhaps not quite as discreet as their speakers imagined, caught fragments of speculation about the hasty marriage and what desperation had driven a duke to rescue Philip Grenville's leavings, and she maintained her composure through sheer force of will, smiling graciously and responding to pleasantries with a dignity that cost her more than anyone could know. Then Alexander led her onto the floor for the first dance, and as his hand settled at her waist and they began to move through the figures of the waltz, Eleanor became suddenly, intensely aware of him in a way that transcended their growing friendship. The strength of his hand, guiding her, the way he looked at her as though she were the only person in the crowded ballroom, the charge that seemed to arc between them when their eyes met and held for a moment longer than strictly necessary. They were halfway through the second dance when Lord Ashworth, a man who had once paid her tepid court before her engagement to Philip, passed near enough to be heard remarking to his companion that the Duke had certainly demonstrated admirable charity in taking damaged goods off the market, and Eleanor felt rather than saw Alexander's reaction the sudden tension in his frame, the dangerous quieting of his expression before he smoothly concluded their dance and turned with deliberate purpose toward Ashworth. What followed happened so quickly that most guests missed it entirely, but Eleanor stood frozen as Alexander approached the man with a cold fury that made his aristocratic bearing seem less polished gentleman and more predatory lord, and in a voice pitched low but carrying unmistakable menace, informed Ashworth that he would apologize to the Duchess immediately, or find himself permanently unwelcome in any home of consequence, that any man who dared insult his wife would answer to him personally. And did Ashworth understand him perfectly clearly? The apology came stammered and pale-faced, and Alexander returned to Eleanor's side and guided her to a private alcove off the ballroom, and there in the sheltered dimness, he said quietly, "I should have protected you from such vulgarity long before now, should have made clear from the beginning that you are not a charity case but my wife, and anyone who fails to show you proper respect fails to show respect to me." Eleanor found herself staring at him with an expression she could not entirely school, something in her chest cracking open at this fierce defense, this public claiming that went far beyond the terms of their arrangement, and when she finally found her voice she said softly, "You did not have to do that, I am accustomed to managing such remarks." But he shook his head and replied, "Perhaps you should not have to be, and perhaps I am weary of pretending that our marriage is merely a convenient arrangement, when you have become far more important to me than convenience could ever explain." And Eleanor felt the last of her carefully maintained barriers beginning to crumble, felt herself softening toward this man who had started as her reluctant savior and was becoming, despite all her resolutions to protect her heart, someone she could no longer imagine living without. Winter settled over Thornbridge Manor with a quietness that seemed to muffle the world beyond the estate's boundaries, snow falling in steady silence through January nights and transforming the grounds into something from a fairy story. And as the cold deepened and darkness came early, Eleanor and Alexander found themselves spending longer hours in the library, that sanctuary that had become the truest home either of them had known, where the fire burned bright and the outside world with all its expectations and judgments could not penetrate. Their evening ritual had evolved beyond companionable silence into something more intimate conversations that began with estate, business, or some passage from a book, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, deepened into territories neither had expected to explore. Confessions offered hesitantly at first, and then with growing trust, as they discovered in each other an understanding that neither had found elsewhere. It was Alexander who first ventured into more personal terrain one evening, when the wind howled against the windows, and Eleanor had remarked on how secure the library felt, like a ship's cabin riding out a storm, and he had looked at her with an expression of such unguarded loneliness that she had gone very still. And after a long moment he said quietly, "I have spent most of my life feeling as though I were weathering storms alone. My father died when I was 12, and my mother retreated so completely into her grief that I became effectively an orphan, while both parents yet lived, raised by tutors and duty, and the weight of a title I inherited too young to properly bear." Eleanor listened as he spoke of a childhood devoid of warmth, of learning to suppress emotion because there was no one to receive it, of becoming the cold, controlled man society expected a duke to be because he had never been shown another way to exist, and she felt her heart breaking for the lonely boy he had been, the isolated man he had become, and without thinking, she reached across the small space between their chairs and placed her hand over his where it rested on the arm of his seat. He stared at their joined hands as though he had never seen such a thing before, and then his fingers turned beneath hers and clasped, holding on with an intensity that spoke of needs long denied, and Eleanor found herself sharing things she had never voiced, her dreams of a different life before her family's circumstances became so dire, her love of learning that had no outlet in a world that valued women only for their marriage prospects, her secret writing that she had abandoned after the scandal because even that small joy had felt like a luxury she no longer deserved. They spoke of books they had loved as children, of ideas they had never dared voice in company, of fears and hopes that neither had imagined sharing with anyone, and Eleanor realized with a clarity that was both exhilarating and terrifying that this meeting of minds and souls in honest conversation was a form of intimacy more profound than any she had imagined, that she was falling in love, not despite their arrangement, but because of these moments where they met as equals, as partners, as two people discovering that beneath their carefully constructed exteriors lived kindred spirits who had been lonely for far too long. Alexander must have felt it too, for as the clock struck midnight and the fire burned low, he said softly, still holding her hand, "I find I am no longer certain what this marriage is. Eleanor," it began as obligation and arrangement, "but you have become something else to me, something I lack the words to properly express," and she felt tears prick her eyes because she understood exactly what he meant, felt the same confusion and hope and terror, wanted to tell him that she was falling for him, but could not quite summon the courage, could only squeeze his hand and whisper, "I know I feel it too. This change between us, and I confess I do not know what to do with these feelings." And they sat there in the dying firelight, holding hands like young lovers, both aware that they were standing at a precipice that would require courage. Neither was certain they possessed, both fighting against the vulnerability that love demanded, even as they felt themselves drawn inexorably toward it, toward each other, toward a future neither had planned but both were beginning desperately to want. Spring came tentatively to Thornbridge Manor, snowdrops pushing through the last frost, and birdsong returning to the gardens, and with it came a transformation in the household, as subtle and inevitable as the changing season. Alexander and Eleanor moving through their days with an awareness of each other that was both exhilarating and terrifying, their conversations deepening, their silences growing more comfortable, their hands finding reasons to touch in passing with an electricity neither quite acknowledged, but both felt acutely, until one morning in early March, when Eleanor was arranging flowers in the morning room and heard raised voices from Alexander's study, a commotion unusual enough in their well-ordered household that she set down her shears and moved toward the sound, arriving at the study door just as it opened to reveal Alexander's face set in lines of such cold fury that she stopped short, and then she saw who stood behind him and felt the world tilt sickeningly beneath her feet. Philip Grenville looked nothing like the charming scoundrel who had courted her a year ago. He was thinner, shabbier, with the dissipated appearance of a man who had lived too hard and found himself at the end of resources, both financial and personal, and when his eyes met Eleanor's they held a mixture of shame and desperate calculation that made her skin crawl, even as she felt, with some surprise, nothing of the devastation she might have expected, no remnant of the heartbreak he had caused, only a distant pity for this pathetic creature who had once held the power to destroy her world. Alexander moved to place himself between Eleanor and his cousin with a protectiveness that was instinctive and absolute, and in a voice that could have frozen the spring morning said, "My wife need not be subjected to your presence. You will state your business quickly and then remove yourself from my home and never return." But Philip, with the recklessness of the truly desperate, pushed past Alexander and addressed Eleanor directly, stammering apologies that sounded rehearsed and insincere, speaking of circumstances beyond his control and mistakes he regretted, asking her to intercede with Alexander on his behalf, to convince the Duke to extend family charity to a cousin who had nowhere else to turn. Eleanor found her voice, though it seemed to come from a great distance, clear and steady despite the unreality of the moment, and she said quietly, "You destroyed my life without a moment's hesitation. Mr. Grenville left me waiting in that church for hours, stole my dowry, ruined my family's circumstances and my reputation, and disappeared without even the courtesy of a note of explanation, and now you come here seeking my assistance?" And she saw him flinch but continued, "I find I have nothing for you, sir, not anger, not forgiveness, nothing at all, save perhaps pity that you have become this hollow thing, and I thank you for your cruelty because it led me here, to this life, to a marriage that has proven far worthier than anything you could have offered." Alexander was staring at her with an expression of fierce pride and something deeper, something that made her breath catch. "But Philip," sensing his avenue of appeal closing, turned ugly in his desperation, and spat that of course she would defend Alexander. Perfect Alexander, who had everything handed to him by accident of birth, who had never had to struggle or compromise, who had always been their grandmother's favorite, while Philip received nothing but criticism and comparison, who had probably orchestrated Philip's ruin just to steal away Eleanor for himself. The accusation was so absurd that Eleanor might have laughed, had Alexander's reaction not been so immediate and dangerous. He crossed the room in 3 strides and seized Philip by the collar with a violence she had never imagined him capable of, and through clenched teeth said, "You will not speak of her, you will not think of her, you will take yourself from this house immediately, and should you ever approach her again, I will destroy you so completely that you will wish you had never been born. Do you understand me?" And there was something in his voice beyond mere anger, a fierce claiming that made Eleanor's heart race. And when Philip had been physically escorted from the manor by footmen, and Alexander returned to where Eleanor stood trembling in the morning room, he took her hands in his and said with an intensity that bordered on desperation, "You are worth 1,000 of him, worth everything, and I will spend whatever remains of my life ensuring you never doubt that truth again." Eleanor maintained her composure through the remainder of that terrible morning, nodding graciously when Alexander assured her that arrangements would be made to ensure Philip never troubled them again, accepting tea from concerned servants who had witnessed enough of the scene to know something significant had occurred, sitting in the drawing room with her hands folded in her lap as though she were merely tired rather than coming apart at the seams. But the moment she was alone, she fled to the gardens where spring was unfolding in defiance of the winter that still gripped her heart. And there, among the early crocuses and budding trees, she finally allowed the carefully constructed walls she had built around her trauma to crumble, weeping with a violence that shook her entire frame, as everything she had suppressed since that day in the church came flooding back, the humiliation, the fear, the certainty that she was unlovable and unworthy, the conviction that she would never be safe or whole again. She did not hear Alexander approach, did not know he was there until his coat settled around her shoulders and his arms came around her with a gentleness that somehow made her weep harder, and she tried to pull away because she could not bear for him to see her like this, broken and ugly and drowning in pain. But he held her firmly and said into her hair, "Let it out, Eleanor, let it all out. You have been so strong for so long. You need not be strong now." And something in his voice, some quality of absolute permission, allowed her to collapse against him and sob as she had not allowed herself to sob even in the worst moments after Philip's abandonment. When the storm finally passed and she could breathe again, she tried to apologize, mortified by her loss of control. But Alexander tilted her face up with infinite care and said, "You have nothing to apologize for. He hurt you terribly, and you have been carrying that hurt alone. But you are not alone anymore, Eleanor. Do you understand? You will never be alone again." And she shook her head because she could not quite believe it, could not quite trust, and whispered brokenly, "I am damaged, Alexander. Something in me is broken. I think perhaps I am incapable of trusting anyone fully, incapable of the kind of love that a marriage should have, and I fear I have trapped you in this arrangement with a woman who cannot give you what you deserve." He stared at her for a long moment, his face working through emotions she could not quite read, and then he said with a raw honesty that stole her breath, "Eleanor, I have fallen in love with you, not with some idealized version of who you might have been without pain, but with exactly who you are, strength and vulnerability, and all the brave ways you have survived what should have destroyed you, and if you are damaged, then so am I. Lonely and cold and uncertain how to love because I have had so little practice, but I want to learn with you. I want to spend whatever time we have discovering how to heal together." And Eleanor felt her heart crack open at his words even as her mind rejected them, saying desperately, "You cannot mean that. You are being kind because you are honorable and you feel responsible, but you should not bind yourself to me out of obligation." And he made a sound of frustration and kissed her forehead, her temples, the tears still wet on her cheeks, and said fiercely, "Listen to me, you are not an obligation. You are the first person who has ever made me want to be more than the cold, dutiful duke everyone expects. You are intelligence and grace, and a courage that humbles me daily. You have become my dearest friend and my greatest comfort, and somewhere in these months you became essential to my happiness, and I am telling you that I love you not because I pity you, but because not telling you feels like a lie. I can no longer bear to live." And Eleanor looked into his eyes and saw the truth there, naked and vulnerable and terrifying in its intensity, and whispered, "I am afraid, so afraid of hoping, of believing, because I do not think I could survive being wrong about this." And he gathered her closer and said with absolute conviction, "Then I will prove it to you every day for the rest of our lives if that is what you need. I will be patient, Eleanor, because you are worth waiting for, worth everything, and I am not going anywhere." Eleanor remained in Alexander's arms there in the garden as the spring afternoon lengthened around them, and gradually her breathing steadied and the terrible fear that had gripped her began to loosen its hold, replaced by something more frightening, still a tentative hope that perhaps, impossibly, what he said might be true, that she might be allowed to have this, to feel this, without it being stripped away as everything else had been. And when she finally found the courage to speak, her voice was barely above a whisper as she said, "I think I have been falling in love with you for months now, perhaps since that first evening in the library when you laughed at something I said, and I realized there was warmth beneath all that aristocratic reserve. Certainly by the winter ball, when you defended me so fiercely, I felt my heart crack open despite all my efforts to keep it safely locked away. And every day since has made it worse and better all at once, because loving you, when I believed you could never love me back, was both the sweetest and most painful thing I have ever endured." She felt Alexander's sharp intake of breath, felt his arms tighten around her as though he would never let her go. And when he pulled back enough to look into her eyes, his own were bright with emotion as he said roughly, "All those moments I thought I was hiding what I felt, maintaining proper distance. You were doing the same all those evenings, when I wanted desperately to reach for you, but convinced myself you could never want the touch of a man after what Philip did. All those times I caught you looking at me and had to look away because I feared you would see too much. We have been circling each other like frightened creatures, too wounded to trust what we most desired." And Eleanor felt laughter bubble up through her tears because it was absurd and beautiful, and so perfectly them, this careful dance they had been performing when they might have simply been honest. And Alexander smiled at her laughter and traced the curve of her cheek with such tenderness that she trembled, and said, "I love the sound of your laughter. I love your intelligence and your courage and the way you treat every person with dignity regardless of their station. I love how you bite your lower lip when you are concentrating on a book and how you hum without realizing it when you arrange flowers. I love that you are kind without being weak and strong without being hard, and I love that you have somehow taught this cold, distant duke how to feel again, how to hope, how to want something beyond mere duty and obligation." Eleanor reached up to touch his face, marveling at the permission to do so, at the way he leaned into her touch as though it were something precious, and she said, "Then perhaps we might try something radical and simply be honest with each other from this moment forward. No more hiding, no more pretending this is merely a convenient arrangement, no more protecting ourselves from the terrifying possibility of happiness." And Alexander said fervently, "Yes, yes to all of it. And I vow to you, Eleanor, that I will spend every remaining day of my life proving that you can trust me with your heart, that I will cherish it and protect it, and never, ever give you cause to regret this leap of faith." And then he was kissing her with a passion that had been restrained for far too long, and Eleanor kissed him back with all the love she had been suppressing, and when they finally broke apart, breathless and trembling, he took her hand and led her back to the manor, and that night they came together not as strangers fulfilling marital duty, but as beloved partners, choosing each other completely. And in the dawnlight that filtered through the windows of his chamber, their chamber now, Eleanor woke in Alexander's arms, and felt for the first time since that terrible day in the church that she was truly, finally, safe. The months that followed their breakthrough unfolded with a sweetness Eleanor had never imagined possible, as though all the pain and loneliness that had preceded this joy had somehow made her capable of appreciating every precious moment with an intensity that might otherwise have escaped her, and she and Alexander fell into a rhythm of partnership that transformed not only their marriage, but the very atmosphere of Thornbridge Manor, which seemed to warm and brighten as their love grew, the grand rooms no longer feeling cold and formal, but rather like a true home filled with laughter and purpose, and the quiet contentment of two people who had found their way to each other through darkness and emerged grateful for the light. They worked together on improvements to the estate, Alexander valuing Eleanor's observations about the tenants' needs and her suggestions for better organization of resources, and Eleanor discovered that she had a talent for management that had never been called upon in her previous constrained circumstances, and together they implemented changes that improved yields and living conditions alike, earning the deep loyalty and affection of everyone who depended upon the estate for their livelihoods. But it was Eleanor's charitable work that became her greatest passion, born from her own experience of abandonment and social ruin, and with Alexander's full support and financial backing, she established a foundation to assist women who found themselves in desperate circumstances through no fault of their own, women jilted at the altar, widows left with debt, daughters cast out by families, anyone who needed refuge and resources and the chance to rebuild a life with dignity. And Alexander watched with pride that bordered on awe as his wife transformed her own pain into purpose, creating something beautiful and necessary from the ashes of her humiliation. The small domestic moments brought equal joy. Mornings when they breakfasted together and planned their day, afternoons when Eleanor would seek Alexander's opinion on foundation matters and he would ask her thoughts on estate business, evenings in their beloved library where they now sat close together rather than at opposite ends of the room, the casual touches that had once been so carefully avoided now freely given and received, his hand covering hers, her head resting on his shoulder, the comfortable intimacy of two people who had learned to trust completely. Eleanor's letters to her family carried news of her happiness and included funds that restored their comfort and security, and gradually even her damaged social relationships began to mend as society witnessed the Duke of Thornbridge's obvious devotion to his wife, and concluded that perhaps they had misjudged the situation, perhaps Eleanor had been the innocent party after all, and invitations began arriving again, though Eleanor cared far less about society's approval now that she had something infinitely more valuable in Alexander's love. It was on a golden afternoon in late summer, when they were reviewing plans for a new cottage on the estate to house women in the foundation's care, that Eleanor felt the familiar flutter in her abdomen and knew with sudden certainty what it meant. And when she looked up and met Alexander's eyes and said softly, "I believe we are going to have a child," she watched his face transform, with wonder and joy so profound it brought tears to her eyes, and he gathered her into his arms with a tenderness that spoke of reverence for the miracle they had created, and whispered against her hair, "You have given me everything, Eleanor, purpose and love, and now this, a future I had not even allowed myself to dream of." And she held him close and thought that this, all of this, had somehow grown from that terrible day in the church, and perhaps there was a strange grace in how the worst moment of her life had led inexorably to the best. It was late summer when Eleanor found herself standing before the church, where she had once waited in humiliation and despair, though now she stood not in a ruined wedding gown, but in an elegant day dress that accommodated her visibly pregnant form, and beside her stood Alexander, his hand resting protectively at the small of her back, and gathered around them was not the absence that had haunted that terrible day, but rather a crowd of tenants and townspeople and members of society who had come to witness the dedication service for the Eleanor Hartley Foundation, the charitable organization that would provide refuge and resources for women abandoned by circumstance or cruelty. And as Eleanor looked up at the church spire against the bright blue sky, she felt the extraordinary weight of transformation, how this place that had represented her absolute nadir had somehow become the starting point for everything beautiful that followed, how devastation and joy were not opposites, but rather points on a continuum that her life had traced with painful precision. The vicar who had waited with her that awful morning now stood ready to bless the foundation, and his eyes when they met hers held not pity but genuine admiration, and as the simple ceremony began, Eleanor felt Alexander's hand tighten slightly on her back, a gesture of support and solidarity that still had the power to move her even after months of such touches. And when it came time for her to speak, she stepped forward with a confidence that the frightened, abandoned bride could never have imagined possessing, and her voice was steady as she addressed the gathered crowd and said, "This foundation exists because I know intimately what it means to have your future stripped away in a single morning, to feel that you have no value and no hope and no path forward, and I know equally well that such moments, devastating as they are, need not be the end of one's story but might instead be the painful beginning of something better than you had dared to dream. Though you cannot see it in the darkness, and must simply endure until the light returns. She saw several women in the crowd wiping their eyes, and knew that her words resonated because suffering was not rare, only the willingness to speak of it openly. And she continued, "What I wish for every woman who seeks help from this foundation is what was given to me, not charity that diminishes, but support that empowers, not pity that isolates, but compassion that connects, and above all the knowledge that your worst moment does not define your worth or determine your future, that dignity and hope can be rebuilt even from complete ruin, and that second chances, though they may come from unexpected sources and in unexpected forms, are nonetheless precious and real, and worth the courage it takes to accept them." When she finished speaking, there was a moment of profound silence and then applause, genuine and warm, and Alexander stepped forward and shocked the entire assembly by speaking without planned remarks, his voice carrying clearly as he said, "My wife speaks of second chances, but what she does not say is that she gave one to me as well. That in marrying a cold, distant man who offered her a business arrangement, she somehow taught him what it means to love and be loved, and I stand before you all today to acknowledge publicly what I tell her privately each day, that Eleanor is the finest person I have ever known, that I am honored beyond measure to be her husband, and that any good I accomplish in this life will be because she showed me how to see beyond duty to genuine human connection and compassion." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face as Alexander took her hand and raised it to his lips in a gesture of devotion that left no doubt about the nature of their marriage. And afterward, they planted an oak tree on the church grounds together, their hands covering the same shovel, and Eleanor thought of how trees grew slowly but enduringly, roots deepening over years, branches spreading to provide shelter, and how perhaps that was the truest metaphor for what they had built together from the ruins of that terrible abandoned wedding. Autumn returned to Thornbridge Manor with its characteristic splendor of gold and crimson leaves, and it was on a cool October evening, exactly 1 year after the foundation dedication, that Eleanor's labor began, the pains starting gently as she and Alexander sat in their library and then intensifying through the long night, while Alexander paced the corridors outside their chambers with an anxiety that would have amused Eleanor had she not been so consumed by the primal work of bringing their child into the world. And when dawn broke pale and grey over the estate grounds and the baby's first cry pierced the air, Alexander burst into the room despite the midwife's protests and found Eleanor exhausted and radiant, cradling a tiny daughter with a shock of dark hair, and the expression on his face as he approached them, wonder and terror, and love so overwhelming it seemed to transform his very features, was something Eleanor knew she would carry in her heart forever. And when he carefully took the baby in his arms, his hands trembling slightly as he supported the impossibly small head, he looked at Eleanor with tears streaming unashamedly down his face and said, "She is perfect. You are perfect. I did not know it was possible to feel this much." And Eleanor reached up to touch his cheek and replied softly, "Now you understand why I was willing to hope again, why the risk of loving is always worth taking." And they named their daughter Catherine Rose after both their mothers, and the christening ceremony a month later brought together Eleanor's restored family and Alexander's dignified relatives and the tenants who had come to love their duchess. And as Eleanor stood in the chapel holding her daughter, she thought of that other church and that other ceremony that never was, and felt nothing but gratitude for how that devastation had led inexorably to this joy. The months that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and tiny milestones, and the peculiar exhaustion and exhilaration of new parenthood, and Eleanor watched with deep tenderness as Alexander proved himself as devoted a father as he was a husband, rising in the night to bring Catherine to Eleanor for feeding, changing nappies with aristocratic dignity somehow intact, walking the halls at dawn with their daughter against his shoulder, singing in a soft, uncertain voice the lullabies his own nurse had taught him, in a childhood he had once described as lonely, but now seemed determined to redeem through the warmth he provided his own child. And Eleanor's foundation continued to thrive even as she managed the demands of motherhood. The cottage on the estate, now home to 3 women rebuilding their lives, and she felt a deep satisfaction in proving that one could be both a devoted mother and a woman of purpose beyond the nursery, that these roles need not conflict, but could rather enrich each other. 2 years passed in this contented rhythm, and then Eleanor found herself pregnant again, and when she delivered a healthy son on a spring morning with Alexander once more at her side, their family felt complete in a way that brought tears of joy to both their eyes, and they named him Thomas Philip, the second name a gesture of forgiveness that Alexander insisted upon, saying that he wanted to redeem even that tainted appellation by attaching it to a child raised in love rather than the bitterness that had shaped his cousin's character. And Eleanor agreed, because she had learned that healing sometimes meant reclaiming what had been spoiled and making it beautiful again. The years that followed were filled with the organized chaos of young children, the sound of laughter echoing through halls that had once been silent and cold, Catherine learning to ride her first pony with Alexander walking beside her, and Eleanor watching from the paddock fence with Thomas in her arms, family dinners, where the formal dining room rang with childish chatter and the relaxed conversation of parents who had learned to find joy in the ordinary, evenings when Eleanor and Alexander would finally collapse in their library after the children were asleep and sit in comfortable silence or quiet conversation, their peace hard-won and therefore precious, and occasionally Alexander would look at Eleanor with an expression of almost bewildered gratitude and say something like, "Do you ever marvel at what we have built from such unpromising beginnings?" And Eleanor would smile and reply, "Every single day." And she meant it, for she had learned that the greatest transformations often began in the darkest places, that the capacity for joy was somehow enlarged by having first known despair, and that love, when it finally arrived after long waiting, was all the sweeter for the patience required to reach it. And as she watched their children grow and their marriage deepen and her foundation expand to help more women each year, she understood that her abandoned wedding had not been an ending at all, but rather the necessary destruction that preceded the building of something far better than she had originally imagined possible, and that Alexander, who had come to that church as a cold, duty-bound duke searching for his wayward cousin, had found instead his salvation in a woman society had deemed ruined, and together they had proven that redemption was real, and second chances were worth the courage required to accept them, and that family was not always what one was born to, but sometimes what one chose to build from the wreckage of other people's failures. 5 years had passed since that grey autumn morning when Eleanor had waited alone in an empty church, and now on a golden afternoon in late September, she stood with Alexander on the sweeping lawn of Thornbridge Manor, watching Catherine, who was now 4 years old, chase her younger brother Thomas through the gardens, while their laughter rang out clear and joyful across the manicured grounds. And Eleanor felt Alexander's arm around her waist, that casual, intimate gesture that still had the power to fill her with wonder, and she leaned into his warmth as they observed their children, with the particular contentment that comes from knowing one's life has exceeded every possible expectation. And Alexander turned to her and said quietly, "Do you remember what you said to me once, that you feared you were incapable of trust or love? Look at what you have built, Eleanor, not just our family, but your foundation that has now helped 43 women restart their lives, and the school you established in the village, and the way the tenants speak of you with genuine affection rather than mere duty. You have transformed not only your own life, but touched countless others." And Eleanor smiled and replied, "We have built it together, for I would have had none of this without your courage in offering me that peculiar proposal, without your patience as I learned to trust again, without your love that taught me I was worthy of being loved." And they stood together in peaceful silence as the afternoon light turned everything golden, and their children's laughter continued to punctuate the gentle sounds of late summer giving way to early autumn. And Eleanor thought of that other autumn 5 years ago when everything had seemed finished and ruined, when she had believed herself destroyed by humiliation and abandonment, and she marveled at the strange, circuitous path that had led from that devastation to this profound joy, how the worst moment of her life had somehow been the necessary prelude to the best, how Alexander, who had seemed so cold and distant at their first meeting, had become the man who knew her heart more intimately than she knew it herself, how a marriage that began as a transaction had transformed into a love story that still made her catch her breath with its depth and tenderness. Dear listener, as Eleanor's story draws to its close, I hope you will carry with you this truth that she learned through such painful experience, that our darkest moments, devastating as they are when we endure them, need not be the end of our story, but might instead be the difficult beginning of something more beautiful than we had imagined possible, that dignity and patience in suffering are never wasted, even when we cannot see their purpose, and that second chances, though they may arrive from unexpected sources and in unexpected forms, are nonetheless real and precious and worth the courage it takes to accept them with an open heart. When you find yourself waiting in your own metaphorical church, abandoned by what you thought was your future, remember Eleanor, who waited 3 hours in a wedding dress for a groom who never came, and yet found a love deeper than any she had dared to dream. And know that your story too is not finished, that transformation is always possible, that hope is not foolishness but wisdom, and that the person you are meant to become often emerges from the ruins of who you thought you would be. May you find the strength to endure your darkest hours with grace, the courage to accept help from unexpected quarters, the patience to let love grow slowly and surely from unpromising beginnings, and may you eventually stand as Eleanor did on a golden autumn afternoon, surrounded by more joy than you believed possible, looking back on your devastation with gratitude for the journey it began. Rest now and trust that even in your waiting, you are not abandoned, and that the story being written in your heart has chapters yet unread that may surpass your brightest hopes, for love has its own mysterious timing, and often arrives not when we demand it, but when we have finally learned to receive it with the depth and wisdom it requires.